program today is timely, I think. It's actually 99 days. But
might as well be 100.
Yeah, but it seemed close enough. So I will turn this over. I've asked Kent Gray to serve as moderator this morning, and it's all yours.
Thanks, Dad. Good morning, everybody. As my dad said, my name is Kent Gray. For those of you who don't know, I had the unusual and interesting experience of serving for 6 months as state director for Illinois and Missouri for Mr. Trump in the primary campaign. And so he thought I might be able to bring a few zingers here and there in as the moderator, and it might be a little bit fun. So even though I'm in the middle, I'm the partisan person here on the panel today.
I'm sitting on your right.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I was going to make a joke about that in a minute. So on my left, Dr. Chris Mooney, who's the Director of Government and Public Affairs over at the University of Illinois at Champaign. And then also on my left, but to my right, just kidding, is Dr. David Racine, is the Executive Director for the Center of State Policy and Leadership at the University of Illinois at Springfield, one of my alma maters. And so welcome, gentlemen. I throw it open to you guys to have about 8 or 9 minutes of discussion to start us off, and we'll have a little round table, and then we'll ask for questions from the audience. Go ahead.
Okay, you want me to go?
Sure.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks a lot, Kent. And one correction, Institute of Government and Public Affairs is a university-wide thing, so we have faculty members on all 3 of the University of Illinois campuses, so we're not a Champaign entity. Keep that in mind. Okay. Thanks for inviting me out. The 100 days mark, as we all know, is an artificial and sort of an impossible place to hold judgment. But, you know, Trump made some promises. He seems to care about it, even though he thinks it's ridiculous. I would have to, we're not quite sure which is the operative one this morning. And he still has another day to get a lot of stuff done. So, this is a good opportunity. It's a good exercise opportunity to collect our thoughts and take a deep breath as the administration sort of starts gearing up into, kicking into its stride here. I just want to start off by throwing out a few, three key impressions that I have had of the first 100 days and sort of pot a little bit. The first impression, I would say, is unprepared. Sort of like I just saw a movie called Unforgiven, and it reminded me, except not quite the same situation, but I felt like it as it was that the movie was going on. But clearly, it seems to me, anyway, that Donald Trump didn't expect to win, that none of the people around him expected him to win. So he was able to promise every crazy thing that popped into his head that seemed to be, get a good reaction in a rally, and he hadn't prepared or to govern, or hadn't learned anything about government to a large extent, and then he alienated the mainstream GOP operatives, both in the primary and then in the general. They didn't think he was going to win, so they didn't want to get tarnished with him to a large extent. So he lost out on a lot of experience that he might have been able to tap into. And he said, so in the end, it's sort of the sort of oddballs and damaged goods and a few generals at the beginning of the administration. I think that's sorting itself out now. This has been a problem for him, and I think the transition in the early days in particular were really a mess, and just in terms of operations, and things may have calmed down a little bit now, but we get that sort of amateur hour thing going on in the White House. You got Sean Spicer with his head exploding, you get him reacting to Saturday Night Live, you get Michael Flynn and all these things. So I think that's the first thing, and I think that's certainly a fixable problem, and I think that they can learn as they go. My second impression I would call definitional issues, and the idea that the president has sort of and his administration has sort of a loose relationship with facts and the truth. And to say is on things like the crowd size, the Obama wiretapping, armada going to Korea and things like that. Is this lying? I don't know, because the way I think about lying is it has to be intentional. And I don't know if the president and his people, is it misinformation that they have? Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it a lack of caring about the truth? Is it self-delusion? Or is it straight up prevarication? I don't know, and I don't really, I think it hardly matters. The key thing is that it has affected his credibility. He's the boy who cries wolf, and when he needs us to believe him, this may have an effect on that. And his shooting from the hip on the tweeting. Again, these are just more words that seem to get him in trouble more than anything else. So again, I think this is something that he can learn, but right now it's just so unusual compared to other presidencies that it stands out. And my third general impression has to do with what I call the comparison problem. Okay, humans assess stimuli comparatively. That's how we work. Is this thing different than that thing, and then I can tell the difference between them. And furthermore, we tend to forget a lot of the bad stuff that's happened to us and remember the good stuff for the most part. Otherwise, women would never have a second child, for example. And the comparison just between business and as usual in the White House today, forget about policy, but just on business in the Obama White House and in the Trump White House, it's stark and it's not flattering to Trump, and it feeds into this sort of impression that they don't know what they're doing. Where you have Obama, they're buttoned up, professional, they're wonky, thoroughly knowledgeable, analytic, and so forth. These are not Trump characteristics, and they're not characteristics of the Trump White House. And even I've had, I think, 3 people recently came to me and said, George Bush, I saw him on TV, and he actually knows something about foreign policy. So George Bush is actually looking, sort of being looking better and more informed and thoughtful in retrospect. And all this feeds into the sort of negative perceptions about Trump, and I think he's hurt by it. Now, again, like the other 2, I think this is a solvable problem, and it may fade with time. But that's just my impressions at the moment. So, how about that?
I remember the good old days working for President Bush when everybody thought he was an idiot. So,
There you go.
Amazing how these things get changed around over time. Dr. Racine, what do you think?
I want to start sort of from the same point that Chris did with a slightly different take. The presidency, in my judgment, is the most complex job in the world. And you might have noticed this morning, I think it was a Reuters interview that President Trump did, where he basically acknowledged that it's harder than he thought it would be. And I think that speaks to the point of it's not just a question of preparation, but sort of the totality of life experience that he's had and what it leads to in terms of his preparation for the presidency. I'm fond of saying that people do what they know and they don't do what they don't know. And what he knows, just by the basis of his history that we know about, having been in the public spotlight for so long, is he's a marketing guy and he does public performance. There was a piece the other day talking about there's a lawsuit. I guess maybe Alex Jones, the conspiracy radio commentator, I guess he's divorced and his wife is suing him or something like that, and his argument against the suit is that he's not actually marketing the truth. He's a performance artist, and so therefore, what he does can't be held against him. And I think that there's something to this with President Trump, that he's an entertainer. I mean, that's what he has been doing for a long time. He responds very well to audience affirmation. Of course, most people in public life do, to at least to a degree. President Reagan had that skill set to a degree, but he had 2 terms as governor of California that sort of equipped him to be the President of the United States. Now, I want to say that even though Mr. Trump's starting out as a guy whose background is in marketing and entertainment, he could evolve into an effective president if he learns, and I want to come back to that in a moment. It's all too early to tell, I think. As Chris indicated, 100 days is, as everybody's been saying, even the president now, it's arbitrary. It's an FDR thing that he invented. He got so much done in the first 100 days, and ever since then we've been using it as a barometer. Since my interest is in government effectiveness, I want to sort of approach this from the perspective of decision making and what we know from that world of research and theory, and applying it to our early experiences with the Trump administration, pro and con. One, I think, and this is a little bit undetermined whether it will stick, there's been a sort of commitment to a mode of decentralization in the operation of the federal government, where agencies would at least in theory, have more room to operate than might have been true over recent presidencies. You saw that with the decision to allow the military to decide to drop the mother of all bombs on the cave structure in Afghanistan. There's some evidence of that. It's all very early. It's all quite chaotic and messy, so it's hard to know where that's going to come out. But if that became a mode of operating, it could be beneficial, at least in terms of agencies having the room to operate, and that's motivating. And when people are motivated and committed, they often do a better job. I think the Gorsuch nomination kind of fits into that category too. He asked for advice from others about who should be appointed, and he picked from that list. It's a little weaker case there, but it shows some ability to at least have others play a role in shaping decisions, which is probably a good thing, assuming that the other people are competent and have the goodwill of the United States at heart. The second thing that is important, it seems to me, kind of in the spirit of the issue of decentralization, is delegation to the most qualified. I do think the approach he's taken to letting the military run the military sort of speaks to that to a degree. On the other hand, under our system of government, we have a civilian commander-in-chief of the military, so the accountability has to be pretty tight there. But that's not a bad thing. Now, whether that extends to the rest of government, whether giving Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, a huge portfolio to manage is delegating to somebody who knows what he's doing, seems to me highly questionable, but it could work in other cases where the people who take on responsibility are capable. I think you're beginning to see that a little bit with the economic team. You might disagree with what they're coming out with, but at least a couple of these people are pretty highly qualified. Now, sort of switching to some more negative attributes of decision making. Overconfidence is a well-studied problem with all kinds of adverse consequences. And I think there's no doubt that now anybody who gets elected president, I suppose they come in overconfident. Maybe even to run for office, you have to be, hugely egotistical and overconfident in your abilities. President Obama was accused of that, probably accurately to a degree. Trump's coming in, and of course, whether he actually believes, whether the confidence that he demonstrates publicly is in the inner recesses of his mind a reality or not is hard to say, but it does sort of, it's manifesting itself in some aspects of decision making. I think just in general with overconfidence you have issues that lead to one thing they call anchoring, meaning that sort of the last impression you got is what drives the judgment you make about how you're going to do something. And we've seen evidence of that in the early days of the Trump administration. And then escalation of commitment to something. The accusation of wiretapping of Trump Towers that Trump made of the Obama administration, in particular President Obama himself. And that just kind of kept going through a series of tweets and public pronouncements. I think is an example of escalating commitment to really a bad idea that doesn't have any evident basis in reality, and it might play well to a certain base of his, but probably is not a good strategy going forward. It should make us a little worried about say the situation with North Korea, where just this morning, I guess it was this morning, where he's talking about we could end up in a major conflict with North Korea now. Maybe that's a bargaining position. We hope it is. There are other examples. I mean, the getting Mexico to pay for the wall, repeal and replacing Obamacare, where there was this, we're going to get all this done, and that demonstrates overconfidence, and then it doesn't happen, in part, again, because I think that this is all new territory for him, that the sort of deal-making he was known for in the business world is much harder to translate into the public sector. There are a couple of disconfirming examples of this. I think he's begun to back off in reasonable ways in certain cases. No longer calling China a currency manipulator is an example of that. It's interesting, by the way, that so much of his action in the first 100 days has been foreign policy, where a president naturally, under our Constitution, has more room to operate, and less so on domestic policy. I suppose repeal and replace made them a little bit recoil from getting too far ahead on domestic policy, although the tax proposals they've made just the other day sort of speaks against that. I think taking Russia from the good column to the bad column is justified by the reality, and that sort of shows some ability to adapt. It may be that his pragmatism has a real purpose to it, that he learns something and then he adapts and moves in that direction, or he flips back again. We don't know yet. It's too early to tell. A second area that I think is important and kind of relates to overconfidence, but is worth emphasizing, is sort of defensiveness in the face of error is a problem in decision making. What happens then when mistakes are made and you defend yourself against them, that it sort of shortcuts the process of learning from experience. You don't devote as much attention to trying to learn from experience. And I think anybody who takes on the presidency, even if you were the vice president, you're on a pretty steep learning curve. You got the fate of the country in your hands, and in some sense the world overall, and you've got to be able to be really committed to learning from experience and taking that into account in formulating your decisions. Obviously, the good examples of this so far are the incessant tweeting. I don't like the idea of Twitter, so let me confess that. I find it's just an exercise in superficiality. It's there for the time being. We'll see how long it lasts as a social media mechanism. But clearly, the president's sort of obsession with using that mechanism to communicate these sort of over-compressed thoughts that often seem rash and ill-considered is problematic. It's just not good in general in trying to conduct the presidency. It does not, I think, lead to a sense of unpredictability that he claims. It makes people kind of wonder where he's at, that he's ever at anywhere in particular. He blamed the Freedom Caucus for the failure of repeal and replace. And then the immigration ban, they got out first out of the gate on that, and then the courts have sort of stood in the way. There is a debate about whether the courts are right, but clearly not really having his ducks in a row in moving forward on that set of issues. He has taken some executive actions that deal with that, but others have been stopped by the courts. I think where there's some learning going on, it may just simply be plain self-interest at stake. The Steve Bannon role, the Svengali in the White House who has been sort of downgraded a bit. We'll see whether that sticks, but that's kind of evidence of that he's learning that you can sometimes have sort of difficult or toxic people in the midst of your presidency who you have to sort of corral in some way and keep from getting too far out ahead of you. I think as I indicated before, I think his changes positions on Russia and China, I'm a little hesitant to call it serious learning from experience. I think having a little bit of time with the head of China, Xi Jinping, is not a basis for suddenly declaring that he's one of the greatest guys in the world. I'm overstating it a little bit, but that's kind of the flavor of it. I spent a little time with the guy, had a 10-minute talk about North Korea, now I'm changing my mind about things. It doesn't seem that he has a core body of knowledge that allows him to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff. But maybe this is lowering the temperature with North Korea, of course contradicted to some extent by his comments just recently. I think the bottom line for me is going to be, and this applies to any presidency, is it's sort of the theme that I'm striking here, is he's going to learn from his experience because, as Chris indicated, he came in, it's not just a question of sort of transition preparation or really thinking he was going to win the presidency, although that's part of it. I think it's that he just doesn't, come in with the sort of requisite set of experiences needed to be an effective president quickly. And maybe he learns from his experience and becomes a more effective leader over time, learns how to work with Congress, can fashion together a coalition. He hasn't figured that out yet. If it's just sort of down the line Republican, I think that's going to be hard because we're already seeing when you move from being the party in opposition to the party in control, suddenly the fissures that exist within your party become much more evident. They were going to move forward. The last thing I'll say, just as another example, they were going to move forward on a new version of repeal and replace in the House, and the latest word is that now they've lost another group of people and maybe don't have enough votes to move forward on that. So I think overall it's been pretty messy because these are not people, by and large, who have sufficient experience. We just hope that they can gain it in the course of the next several months and leading into next year. If the midterm elections go badly for them, then it's a whole new game.
So let's unpack this a little bit and go back to November. So as political scientists and dealing with a lot of professors, obviously, that are teaching a lot of our area students in central Illinois and around Illinois issues, what are the lessons that we learn from the election side of it? I always brought up the fact that leading up to the election, I thought there was a big shy voter bias, and I would have political professionals would tell me, sitting on the panel, that doesn't exist. We have research that says that doesn't exist. And I said, well, the interesting thing that I find is I have people that come over and they say, I want to get a yard sign. And I'd give them a yard sign, and it'd never end up in their yard. Or they'd say, I want to have a hat, but they'd never wear it. Or I want to have a bumper sticker, but it wouldn't end up on their car. But I know they got out to vote, and I know that they supported him. It was a very strange dynamic politically. There weren't a lot of cheerleaders. What do you think about the issues that come out of why Donald Trump became president?
Well, you're right about that. I mean, in general, from what I know about survey research literature in this topic, and we at the IGPA, we had some people working on this last year for this exact reason. Are people going to be embarrassed to say who they're going to vote for if there's some kind of social desirability thing? And it kind of parallels what was known as the Bradley effect, which is named for a guy named Tom Bradley, who ran for governor of California in 1982, something like that, back in the 80s. But he had been the mayor of Los Angeles, and he was black. And he polled highly. Who did he lose to? Pete Wilson?
Pete Wilson.
Pete Wilson. So it was 90-90 then. And Bradley was polling highly throughout, and then lost to Wilson, who was white. And the thesis was that people were afraid to say they're not voting for the black guy. And so there was a bias in the polls. But most of the research, as I understand it, that's been done post that election was that it didn't really happen. People don't really vote strategically. I mean, they're going to do what they're going to do. And so, there's going to be a lot of research done on this. I mean, God knows everybody's trying to figure out what happened. Anytime there's an unusual event, and I think no matter if you're a Trump supporter or not, one has to think that November 8th was an unusual event. We didn't expect it. Trump didn't expect it. Nobody expected it. I didn't expect it up until about 9 o'clock at night. I was having, people. My wife was there. Who, full disclosure, I live with someone who's not a great fan of Donald Trump, and an old friend of mine. And we were going to go out, and they were mesmerized by the results. And I said, "Don't worry, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, don't worry. Yeah. I mean, it's not going to happen." And then it did happen. And, it was just one of those things. And now we're trying to figure it out. You have all these books, Hillbilly Elegy, White Trash, books about, these are books that I take offense to, because these are my people. But people are trying to understand what's going on, and it reflects back on, we've had this, American government, American politics has had a certain nativist, xenophobic, reactionary kind of group for many years. I mean, you go back to the American Party in the 1850s and the Know-Nothings and the Red Scare after World War II and World War I and the John Birch Society and the Tea Party and so forth. I mean, there's strong themes there that we can see following up through. Now, whether or not people are, and to what extent they're afraid to own those sorts of feelings, I don't know. And one of the things that we were seeing in polling post the election that is unusual is that it's very typical that a president, somebody wins the presidency in November with, say, 51% of the vote, and then they do surveys after, and they find that 55% of the people say they voted for the person, because whether or not they did or they just think they did or they wish they did, but it's a pretty consistent finding. That's not happening with this president. In fact, the polling showed that his approval ratings have gone down to a certain baseline or core or whatever. So yeah, I don't know how that factors in there either.
I think he's got his core,
Yeah.
and they're sticking with him, but he hasn't been able to expand it because, of course, the first 100 days have been a bit of a mess. The reality, of course, is that he lost the popular vote, and it wasn't a small margin. I mean, 2%'s pretty substantial, and that polling, when you take the margin of error into account, it's not that far off. They weren't that far off nationally. State polling is less reliable. It's a smaller base, and they don't do as many, and so it's harder to predict. I think if you're you've got the news media that are constantly feeding you the results of polls, and the majority of the news media would sort of be indicating that it didn't. All these odds makers about how the odds of Trump winning was 15% or whatever. Really. Going into the last few days before the vote. And so it's not surprising in any election that you can't draw a bead on everybody, right? I mean, as you indicated, Chris, I mean, they do what they do when they go into the polling booth. And so polling can only go so far in picking up on what people are going to actually do once they get inside the booth, and you've always got some element of undecideds. The reality, what we come out of this election with, it's not a huge endorsement, it's not a big mandate for Donald Trump when you look at the vote. He won the Electoral College. Even Sean Spicer the other day wanted to again claim that it was a massive win, and it wasn't by historical standards. It was relatively modest. It was a win's a win. Electoral College vote that takes, if you do the map, it's the center of the country, including us, sweeping down through the South, going east. And the rest of the country, certainly on the coast, voted for Hillary Clinton. And as I say, that's where the largest popular vote is. So if you're president, to kind of put this in perspective in terms of what the consequences are for operating the government, I mean, you have to recognize that you didn't get some huge ringing endorsement. Now, whether in the president's private thoughts he recognizes that is hard to say. Certainly publicly he's not willing to acknowledge that, but it suggests that we're in this moment in history where, and this has been going on a while, Obama obviously had the same problem, where and Illinois too, where it's sort of divided down the middle. Now, I don't know why that is. I mean, was there some sort of law of nature that argues for, you got to have two sides and they should be about equal? You don't play football with 8 men on one side and 11 on the other. Is that how this works? So who knows? I mean, we don't know really what accounts for it being so evenly divided. We can, slice and dice the voting data and approval rating data and so on using the appropriate demographic factors, but you still don't really get a good sense of why it splits so evenly. Clearly, I mean, when you realize that the difference in this election was white working class voters in the middle of the country and in the South. And so, and if you think about the Tea Party as sort of the, kind of the right edge of the Republican Party, and it's white. It has a sort of more of a mix from an educational standpoint, but a lot of working class people too. There's a good book that came out. I never remember the titles of books. I'm sorry. I can remember their authors' names. Arlie Hochschild, who's a sociologist, a pretty well-known one. We had gone down to, for the past 5 years, has been going to the Bayou in Louisiana. You might have read it. It was a National Book Award finalist this last year. And getting to know the people in the Tea Party, wanting to understand the world from their perspective. And when I was reading that book, I was thinking, how different are they from, they're in the Bayou, so there's a different culture to some extent, but how different are they than, blue-collar workers with a high school education in Michigan, in terms of the way they look at the world and the sort of economic opportunities available to them. Down the Bayou, the sort of the central point in Hochschild's book is and this is sort of summed up. I'm going to just do a paraphrase that they're Tea Party members and they voted for Trump because yes, their environment is being destroyed by chemical plants that have ruined the large parts of that natural wetland because jobs come before the environment. And I think that's sort of, to me, like a sub-theme. It defines populism to some extent. Yes, there are other elements of populism, and certainly Breitbart and other sort of far-right leaning websites and news sources pick up on all kinds of themes there. But the fundamental issues, I think from the standpoint of people voting, are economic. And
so let's talk about that a little bit on Tea Party, because in the primary, the Tea Party and the ideological conservatives were nowhere with Donald Trump. And to be honest, I almost didn't work for Donald Trump. I had to have a deep think when I got asked to do that job, because this is a guy who'd been a Democrat not all that long ago.
Right.
He is no social conservative. He has become, obviously, announced pro-life, and he has some other issues that are obviously more conservative. But,
you do what you have to
do. Those of us who are kind of ideologically conservative over the years probably find him to be quite a bit more philosophically nimble on issues than we
Nice way
might
to put
like.
it.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up reading National Review when I was in my teens and early 20s. I'm not sure
That's
Donald
a sad
Trump
thing
did.
to think about.
I know. Just for the cartoons.
Yeah, right.
I'm not so sure Donald Trump did. So, I had this, one of my good progressive female Democrat friends I was talking to, and she said, oh, it's horrible that Donald Trump won and everything else. And I said, we got to remember, the expectations are horrible. President Obama's expectations were this high. I mean, they were through the roof. Everybody expected everything to get done that he ever wanted to do. And he didn't quite get there on some things, and left some folks on the progressive side unhappy. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump's expectations are so low, so incredibly low. And I told my friend this, I said, if he doesn't start a nuclear war, which this week is closer, if he doesn't start a nuclear war and doesn't put all of you in some kind of camp, has he exceeded those expectations? And she was kind of like, well, yeah. And to be honest, I think the first 100 days is maybe he will exceed a lot of those expectations. Not that the progressives are ever going to love him, but the point is, this is a guy who, and he said it immediately when the conservative group in the House said, we're not going to vote for this Obamacare repeal. He immediately said, well, I can work with the moderates in the Republican caucus, and I can work with some of the Democrats to fix the problems with it. And boy, that brought them back online pretty quick, because the guy overall is, if he's one thing, he's a deal maker. So it'd be interesting to see, this is probably the least ideological president we have had, somebody bound to the convention of either the Republican or Democrat party, platform. And I wonder if that's going to make him more or less, effective going forward.
Well, that's a good question, and it actually begs a question whether or not that is something we would like in a president, somebody who actually has values that we can understand and that we can count on, and that we can then make our vote appropriately. And I think that's one of the things that worried me going in after November 8th. and I think it's panning out, is that we don't know what this guy thinks, and we don't know what he believes, and it seems to change with the day, with the tweet, and he contradicts people within his own administration. So it's and that may be, and they're trying to make they're trying to make that seem like a good thing, in that he's keeping his enemies off balance. But I think they're trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear there. I don't think they're doing it. I think it's just the way he is. And maybe that will keep them on their toes, but generally diplomacy is not based on, international diplomacy is not based on thinking there's a lunatic on the other side of the table. We want to know what interests are, and they want to work together on them. And I think it's the same thing with voters. We want to know what people are going to do when they get in, and then make our judgment based on those comments. And so that leads to me to some of this post, again, trying to figure out, okay, who voted for Trump and why, and what do they think now? So you're getting a lot of these stories in the news. Go back, what do you think? You're a Trump voter, are you disappointed? And you're hearing comments like, well, if he does half of what he does. Oh, I voted for him just to shake things up. Oh, it was basically a thumb in the eye of the establishment by a lot of people that feel like they're getting screwed, and especially working class people, and various stripes, especially white working class people. Whether that's true or not, that's the sort of feeling that they have. And let's just, how much worse can it be? Everybody in my trailer park is addicted to heroin, and like you said about the people on the south side of Chicago, right? How much worse can it be? Give them a chance. So they're just going to throw them up there and see what happens. And now we're seeing it. And the question is, can he evolve a set of principles that he can then make decisions strategically on? We haven't seen anything like that yet, other than America first, but only when it really counts. Not really. China is bad. Now China is cool now. We had a cake, and everything's good.
At Mar-a-Lago.
It was a terrific cake.
It was the best cake in the world.
It was a Mar-a-Lago cake.
one of the best cakes ever.
Mar-a-Lago, that's right.
Let me just, can I just,
Real quick, I want to touch on that real quick before we go to the audience for questions. So one of the things that a lot of people that you talk to who are not involved in politics always get unhappy with is politicians on both sides of the aisle that are ideologically rigid. In other words, they're a captive to their special interest because they have to abide by the party platform, because they have to be this to be Republican, they have to be this to be Democrat. Probably the most recent thing on the Democratic side is you have very few pro-life Democrats anymore, because that's not a welcome position on the Democratic Party side. So you have that. And then you have the popular culture that talks about designated survivor right now has a president in Kiefer Sutherland. Maybe he's your favorite president right now, as opposed to who is president. But for instance, he is listed as an independent and completely able to pick and choose the best way forward on various issues for the country.
Because that's what you were. Let me just respond. I think that there is a certain kind of advantage to not being ideologically rigid as president, and having the ability to cobble together the coalitions you need to get things done for the American people, not for yourself. And I think, but a key element in that, in my judgment, is reliability. When Jim Edgar, not to kind of bring this to the Illinois situation too specifically, but in the course of the this contretemps over getting a state budget that seems to be forever. Jim Edgar, we quoted him in Illinois Issues, I think, at some point, talked about the importance of trust. and so when you're trying to work out deals politically, people have to be able to trust one another to a degree. And I think that that's not the case in business, per se. You trust only to get whatever you need from it, and you might never go and do a deal with those people again, right? You buy a company and you're done with it. And in politics, the people are still around. I mean, they're not going away. And so you got to be able to signal that you're a reliable partner with whoever you need to accomplish something. And that seems to be missing in my book so far. So there's a certain advantage in Trump not being ideological, being pragmatic about things, but then you certainly have to know, you have to have sort of goals, things you want to accomplish. They have to be things that at least some substantial part of the population would benefit from or would agree with. And then you have to have the ability to signal reliability to the people you want to deal with. And I think that so far, because it's just sort of been all over the place, attacking back and forth from one position to another, it makes it hard for people to feel that they can have confidence in him. And look at, that approval rating is pretty key to how members of Congress sort of calculate how far do I want to go in giving this guy what he wants, since it's not going to matter a whole lot because his approval rating is too low. So it does seem to me that there's work to do on that front.
Folks, who would like to go first with a question? There are no questions. None of you, oh, okay. Nobody
Speeches?
here has any
Speeches?
interest in this topic. You got a microphone? All right. Oh.
We have chaos here in Illinois and chaos in Washington, and I wonder if you all would compare the chaotic situations.
Well, the
Relative chaos?
situation in the national level is they have better cake.
I don't know. Did you get better Portillo's lately? I heard we were going to open up one in Champaign.
Talk about chaos, yeah.
Yeah. It's boy, that's a good question. And I think on the face of it, some people draw parallels. They say, oh, you've got a neophyte governor. He's never been in government before. He's coming in and he's shaking up the place. And but I think one thing we can say about our current governor is that he does have, at least, he does have principles, or he does have bottom lines, and sometimes the list is long, sometimes it's short, but he has been willing to really do whatever it takes to try to get through what he wants passed in the legislature on the substantive and structural reforms that he's interested in, whereas the president, as we've just discussed, it doesn't work. Oh, couldn't get it this week. Boom, move on. Obamacare, no, forget about it. We'll go. Let's do. No, let's do that. Let's bomb somebody. So the governor is extraordinarily disciplined.
Right.
The governor sticks to. He's very much focused on in his agenda, and most of the research on this. On executive power suggests that his approach is probably going to be more effective in the long run, because when you have a broad and amorphous agenda, usually you can't get much of it done because you're dissipating your energies. Now that doesn't mean that the governor is going to get what he wants, because you can't by just sheer force of will. Oftentimes, you can't get things done because it's when you've got people that are opposing you for policy reasons, philosophical reasons, or if you just don't have the levers of power. On the face of it, two businessmen coming in, shaking up their respective capitals, it seems like it might be similar, but I think the dynamic underlying it is pretty different.
So is the governor too ideologically rigid?
No. He's just a libertarian. I think that I take it a little bit more. I'm a little more serious about in both cases, the reality of an elected chief executive who has no prior experience in public service. There's an expertise that goes with. I mean, we we're a democracy. Anybody can run for office and get elected, and we have to maintain that. But there's in a complex world, there's something to be said for knowing what you're doing. And so, in both cases, I mean, this is sort of an interesting signal in my view, of the sort of state of our politics, where we're willing now to elect into office people who don't have any prior experience because it's so tainted, right? I mean, if you're a professional politician, that's a bad thing. And so let's bring in somebody who isn't and see what that does. In some ways, American democracy and Illinois democracy is just an ongoing experiment, as it has always been the case. So we're experimenting now to see whether or not that works. I hope it works in terms of eventually moving through chaos to get something done. But it is sort of, I suppose my sense is that we're usually better off as a society when we're kind of committed to muddling through, kind of going slowly and making changes, unless something dramatic happens, somebody drops a nuclear bomb on us, God forbid, and we have to respond. But barring these sort of more dramatic developments in human life, if you can kind of get through, you're better off. It doesn't satisfy all the public. Obviously, that's why in both, I think to some extent, why both Governor Rauner and President Trump were elected. But what you see now, the consequences in both cases where they are quite different, and one's disciplined, the other isn't, but where they in some sense lack the tools for getting things done, because they don't have the experience. And you just, as I said before, you hope that they learn on the job how they might be able to make something happen.
Let's take a question right over here.
Yeah, okay. When you look at what happened in November, Nate Silver has been issuing all sorts of opinions as to what caused it. And his opinion number 9, which was on March 10th, said, well, it was just groupthink in Washington that didn't resonate with the rest of the country, and maybe it was some cognitive bias or something like that. I was wondering, do you think there's any groupthink in Washington that doesn't resonate with the rest of the country?
Well,
go ahead, Chris.
one thing, Nate Silver is dancing as fast as he can. I mean, he would live by the sword, he died by the sword, and he was a genius in 12, and now not so much in 16. But hopefully he got a good contract with the New York Times, and everything is going to be good for him. There's an old saying that
He's free of the Times now.
is he?
Yeah.
Oh, they let him
It's
go.
538.
Didn't he go
Okay.
to, isn't that sponsored by ESPN now?
I think it is.
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
yes,
so he's
right.
probably out of a job this week too.
ESPN, the polling unit.
There you go.
Yes,
That
right.
tells you what's
They're
wrong
all-
with
all sport.
ESPN when
It's
they're
all
hiring
sport,
a
yep.
political poster.
Yeah. So, whether there's groupthink in Washington, there's groupthink everywhere. There's groupthink in this room. I mean, that just happens. And it may not be. I mean, is Washington different than the rest of the country? People, I don't know. I mean, we have a democracy which is almost a hyper representation. I mean, we think of it as, especially members of the House of Representatives, they're back, they're in the districts all the time. They listen carefully. They're desperate to get reelected. And I know we've got, problems with redistricting, not only in Illinois but across the country in terms of making districts perhaps safer than they would otherwise be if we didn't have that effort. But they're there's an old book by a guy named Thomas Mann back, I think in the early 70s, called Unsafe at Any Margin, that no matter how much policymakers are winning by in a given election, they're worried that they're going to lose the next election, especially in the legislative branch. And it happens, and everybody serving in the General Assembly and everybody serving in Congress knows a colleague who used to be sitting right there who was winning 60, 70% of the vote and suddenly got beat unexpectedly. So they want to know what we think. They're very sensitive to the voters. And so I'm less sympathetic to the idea that somehow there's this cabal of people that are trying to, elites, the old trilateral commission or whatever kind of, canard it is of the day. But of course, I may be wrong about that, but that's my feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's. Yeah, I agree with that. I think groupthink in the way we define it, as sort of there's a sort of intention behind it. I do think that the dilemma, and this is not new today. It's been going on for a while now, at least probably since the mid-70s or so. Washington D.C. Is a sort of community apart. It's distant from the day-to-day reality that occurs in the country. Yes, and members of the House of Representatives, they're back in their districts and they're paying attention to their constituents, and everybody does polling, and they're trying to figure out how do I get elected on the basis of the numbers. And they've been having some town hall meetings that have been pretty worthwhile recently, I think, in terms of hearing from the voters on various things, including Obamacare, I think would be the big one there. But it's a sort of a full-time thing to be in Washington, D.C., determining the direction of the country. And our mechanisms for really learning what the public wants, what its concerns are, I think are probably not as strong as they need to be. A lot of it's channeled through the media, and the media can be, the channel width is only so broad, it can only accommodate so much. And the sheer complexity, I mean, the only other thing I'd say on this is that my wife and I went to Washington, D.C. in 1975, and over the next 20 years, we were there 15 years, and it was a sort of a smallish place when we went there. And you go there now, and you can't move on the roads. This is massive. It's one of the wealthiest places in the country. And what does that tell you? I mean, it's interesting. We're not accomplishing as much from a policy standpoint these days, despite the fact that the overall, this is not just government people, by the way. I mean, it's the lobbying firms and defense contractors, the whole Beltway phenomenon. It's just a massively built up place, indicating to me a huge amount of complexity that only increases the challenge that policymakers face in trying to make wise decisions. I'm not saying that all of them are motivated to be wise, but certainly that's the expectation, and many of them do have the best of intentions, but it's hard to do it. So I do think that there's a groupthink in the sense that people become, to some extent, disconnected from the reality, but that's partly because it's hard to absorb all of it.
And you also have to remember, just quickly, that there's also groupthink among the people who are outside of D.C.
Of course,
who
all of
think,
us, right?
it's a bunch of people padding their wallets, and it's like people around the state think about Springfield, a bunch of crooks, and they're down there, So
Right.
policymakers aren't the only one to have these misperceptions.
In the back there in the blue shirt.
Yeah. We had the Monroe Doctrine, the Truman Doctrine. The media quickly came up with the Bush Doctrine, and I've already heard them talk about what is the Trump Doctrine. And I've heard one of the media analysts on television said Trump isn't a doctrinal person, that he's a transaction-based president.
Right.
And when I see that, when I consider him that way, I see his presidency explained, I'm just about the transaction. So that's why he's willing to let go of the wall, and he can put it off till September.
He's not letting go of that wall.
No, that's right. But he's willing to wait until September. He's not ideological.
I got hit up for the
Have to prove it now.
GoFundMe thing the other day to give $20 to help
To the
build
wall?
the wall. Yes.
Yeah, right.
So we're.
So my question, though, is this is a major change to the White House. We've always had presidents, Eisenhower, Reagan, Truman, who had ideas and principles. But now we've got a transaction-based president, which is a change for the voter. How likely is the American public willing to accept a transactional presidency for the rest of the future? And are we missing the forest for the trees because we still expect to find a Theodore Roosevelt or an Eisenhower?
Just quickly, I think that if being a transactional president gets things done, I think he'll be okay. And if he can't, then he won't. The question would be whether being transactional in the absence of a coherent strategy is going to get what you need done. Politics is transactional. I mean, there's a lot of transactional aspects to politics so in some ways Trump is kind of designed for that. But if you don't have a strategy, just goes back to Chris's point at the very beginning about having some sort of values or belief system that kind of guide the transactional work that you do, then it's sort of all bets are off in terms of predicting whether you're going to get good results or not.
Yeah, Reagan would be a good example of this. He was a person that had clear ideas about what government ought to do and what government ought not to do, and at a very broad level. But he was also very practical, and he was transactional to the extent that those were tactics to get to the strategic goal. And the problem again that we're seeing with Trump, the difference is that we don't know what his strategic goals are, other than some very vague, make America great again, right? So,
It's a great hat.
yeah. It's a great concept.
We got
Great ad.
We got
Told you,
like
he's
2
a
minutes.
marketer,
We got
right?
2 minutes left, and I'll just throw in a little extra on for those of you interested in politics. This is kind of an inside view that nobody really has talked about much. So the folks that I'm friends with who were very high up in the campaign towards the end could not figure out what Hillary Clinton was doing. And they've told me this. I've sat over beers and tried to figure this out. They couldn't figure out why she wasn't in Wisconsin. They couldn't really figure out why she wasn't in Michigan till the last minute, which was a reactionary thing for her. So what they have found out, and interestingly, some of this came from Bobby Mook to Corey Lewandowski, was they thought they were going to lose the popular vote and win the Electoral College. Tells you how much they knew about what the campaign was going to do, or our side knew about what the deal. And so they spent a significant amount of money, millions of dollars that they could have spent in Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania, on California and New York. California, because it has changed to this new primary system where you elect the top 2 vote getters, so it's not necessarily a Democrat and a Republican like we have here in Illinois. You have a ton of districts where you had 2 Democrats on everything, plus everybody knowing that Hillary Clinton was going to win California. So they had a huge drop-off in Republican vote in California that they didn't anticipate because of this new change to the primary system where they had all the Democrats, and it drove up the popular vote, and she did win the popular vote. But they didn't see that coming, and they left a little bit on the table back in the Midwest, and that's probably what turned the election. So something to think about as you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Dad, anything else? That's it. Enjoy the day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.